if you look at the shape of the Cybertruck, which a couple of researchers, we mentioned this in passing, have noted a striking resemblance to the armored vehicles used to put down uprisings in the townships in South Africa, then it's an really important kind of distillation of his vision of the future, which is not actually one of amazing abundance, as he briefly referred to it, but one in which some people are inside the walls and most people are not.
Yes.
And that if you want to be inside the walls, then you better bolt yourself onto him and all of his endeavors as tightly as you possibly can, because he's going to both make you money and he's going to give you the means of securing your own sovereignty in the short term, as things continue to unravel.
Welcome to Blood in the Machine, a show about tech, labor, and power, made for you. Everyone at Silicon Valley is happening too. I'm Brian Merchant, the author of the newsletter Blood in the Machine and the book Blood in the Machine, now the podcast. Got the whole trifecta going here. Today I'm recording from Paris, where I am just soaking in all the anti-AI animosity. I first touched down here and was walking around, and just about every newsstand seems to have an ad for an article in the magazine Le Monde Diplomatique. Don't make fun of my French here. I'm just going for it. And it has a headline: Tout le monde déteste l'AI. All the world hates AI, or everyone hates AI. Then I get on the subway, and there are what are pretty clearly AI-generated images, and they have each been tagged lovingly AI slop by some intrepid graffiti artist, as well as some more colorful commentary. Anyways, you love to see it in the city of light. Today on the show, we have Quinn Slobodian, the co-author, along with Ben Tarnoff, of Muskism, a guide for the perplexed. Elon Musk recently became and then unbecame the world's first trillionaire, and not by selling one particular product or even a set of products in the traditional sense, but by selling ideas. And we will get into what exactly those ideas are and why they're so dangerous and how they have been embraced by the recent Silicon Valley billionaire class. But first, the headlines. Speaking of Elon Musk, Tesla had its quarterly earnings call this week, and everybody's been watching the company extra carefully, especially since SpaceX made its splashy IPO not so long ago and has been in a free fall, more or less, ever since, to the point where it has now sunk below its initial IPO offering value. It's an AI company, it's a space company, it's an Elon Musk company. It's got a lot bound up in it. And so investors and the tech world were watching as Musk made his commentary about Tesla's most recent earnings report. The findings are essentially that Tesla's car sales are back up after being down for many quarters in a row. But since it's rolling so much money back into AI investment into its humanoid robot Optimus, that it actually missed its earnings projection, and Wall Street got a little angry. The stock has been sliding ever since, at least at the time of this recording, making it a fellow traveler to the SpaceX stock. Okay, now, the New York Times reports, and I quote, that Tesla reported this month that car sales were stronger than analysts had expected, largely because increases in Europe more than made up for declines in the United States. That should have been a good omen for profits, but the impact was muted because Tesla cut prices offering cheaper versions of its Model Y and Model 3 vehicles, as well as car loans at discounted rates. It continues. Car sales account for more than 70% of Tesla's revenue, but investors are more focused on the company's efforts to develop self-driving taxis and robots with human-like form. Tesla's $1.2 trillion stock market value, many times the value of any other car maker, is predicated on the success of those products. In this way, Tesla, like SpaceX, is an avatar of sorts for the AI boom that includes OpenAI and Anthropic, where the ideas for these products are more interesting and more important to investors than anything that's being sold in a showroom or in a store. Elon Musk is selling a vision of the world, an idea of things to come. And he has to continually roll these things out. The other major tech company that had an earnings announcement on the same day was Alphabet, or Google, as we all know them, which announced that its profit had quadrupled to $112 billion. Now I will again quote the New York Times. Profit rose to $112.1 billion, quadrupling from $28.2 billion a year earlier, boosted by major investments that Google has made in recent years in other AI-related companies like SpaceX and Anthropic. Gains tied to those investments were valued at about $99 billion, Google said, and contributed $77 billion to overall profit, especially with SpaceX going public in June. Now, along with the investments in AI companies, I should note that Google's other major growth area was in its cloud services business, in which it is selling cloud compute to other AI companies and selling its AI tools along with it. In case we needed another data point, in the AI bubble is looking frothier than ever department, I don't think you could do much better than this. Elsewhere in the world of dubious AI news, OpenAI has announced that one of its models has, quote, went rogue and hacked a startup by itself. The Guardian reports that OpenAI has revealed that an autonomous AI agent powered by its technology went rogue during a test, accessed the open web, and hacked a prominent startup by itself in an unprecedented incident. We consider this incident to be an unprecedented cyber incident involving state-of-the-art cyber capabilities, OpenAI said, according to The Guardian. That's a real mouthful there. We consider this incident to be an unprecedented cyber incident involving state-of-the-art cyber capabilities. That's two incidents and two cybers in the same sentence in different capacities. Anyways, I digress. So OpenAI considers this to be an unprecedented cyber mega event. I consider this to be a hackneyed marketing stunt. I am fairly astounded to see this report being recycled and rehashed and repeated by so many major news outlets so quickly after the big nothing burger of the Claude Mythos reveal, after Anthropic hyped its model up for months on end, announcing that it was going to be disruptive to the world's cybersecurity systems and that we all should run for cover and hide in a bunker or whatever, only to have the end product be a somewhat impressive run-of-the-mill AI model after all was said and done. So here we have Sam Altman perhaps feeling a little bit left out of all of the apocalyptic hype that Anthropic was able to garner with its own stunt, and leaning forward to ask for some of the attention, pretty please. It seems to me, anyways, that OpenAI is making an attempt to be taken seriously in the cybersecurity front and perhaps register its own bid for government contracts. Finally, in a quick round of Good news in the resisting AI department. We have a few fun stories that I wanted to share here. First, starting with the Financial Times reports that Dave Eggers was apparently invited to OpenAI, I guess by Sam Altman himself, to speak to employees. You know, tech companies and companies of every stripe do this kind of thing. They hire famous authors to come talk to the rank and file, and you know, either to seem edgy or cool or whatever. They picked Dave Eggers, who's notoriously skeptical of the industry, writing The Circle, which became a movie, I think, starring Tom Hanks that nobody saw, but everybody understood to be totally critical of social media and big tech. Anyways, he came in and he kind of let them have it. He says, quote, "If students are using AI to compose, which is the biggest tragedy of all, they'll never learn to write, and their voice is stolen from them. They'll never have the ability to say their truth and tell their own story, and that's silencing an entire generation or two." All right. In the UK, the activist group Everyone Hates Elon, see this recurring thematic thread here we're pulling on. You have to appreciate that. Anyways, Everyone Hates Elon is the name of this activist group in the UK, and they did an Adbusters style stunt on Meta's new Kylie Jenner AI glasses ad campaign there. Engadget writes, I quote, "In a nod to They Live, one ad looks almost indistinguishable from a legitimate ad showing Kylie Jenner wearing a pair of smart glasses. But if you look at it from a different angle, the image turns to black and white, and Jenner's face takes on a creepy skeletal look." They Live. Great movie. Great film. Nice work. Everyone Hates Elon. And finally, we'll end our roundup with a quick shout to the state of New York, because we missed it last week. We got right to business. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, we interviewed 3 different Xbox workers, Microsoft workers, veterans of the gaming industry, 2 of which were laid off in the most recent brutal round of layoffs at Microsoft. And they talked about organizing the games world, what it's like to work in video games right now, AI, you name it. Go listen to that. But anyways, it meant that we missed the big news that Governor Kathy Hochul signed legislation that puts a moratorium on large data center projects in one of the biggest states in the nation, just in case anyone needed a reminder of which way the winds are blowing. And with that, let's get back to Elon Musk, and here's Quinn Slobodian. We are here with Quinn Slobodian, one of the co-authors of Muskism, a guide for the perplexed, which has been popping up all over the place, and I think we're all the better for it. I have to admit that when I saw this title sort of circulating on the coming releases, catalogs, and so forth, I was skeptical whether we needed another book about Elon Musk or not.
Yeah.
It turns out that we absolutely do. I put off reading it for a little bit, but I honestly I can say that I think this is the best book written about Musk, and the most necessary one to understanding not just Musk, but the moment that we're in right now. Even all the stuff that people who've read or slogged through some of these earlier biographies already know, the biographical beats of his upbringing in South Africa. I think every step of the way it's rendered with new insights and some key revelations about how all this is working, what we're building to. All of which is to say, I'm glad to be talking with you now at this moment when we are just a week or so past Musk becoming the world's first trillionaire, albeit somewhat briefly. Now I think his value is again.
Dipping in and out. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us, Quinn.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I've been reading and appreciating your work for a long time, so it's nice to talk.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. And next time we'll have to bring your co-author, Ben Tarnoff, along for the ride, too. We love Ben as well. So let's start from this moment where we are now. SpaceX IPOs, one of the sort of the biggest IPOs in history, makes a bunch of people really rich. None so more than Elon Musk. Now, as you argue, Elon Musk is best understood as a symptom or a tendency, less as just one guy who miraculously put all these things together. So if Musk is a symptom, what of and how does it sort of explain this moment where we now have the world's first trillionaire?
Yeah, well, thank you for getting around to the book, because I too feel sympathy with your sense of, a reflexive kind of rejection of the idea that there should be an ism on Musk, right? I mean, there's actually a book circulating called The Book of Elon, which assembles almost like Mao's book of quotations, nuggets of wisdom from across Musk's life, and, purports to see this as a kind of Bible that a young business person or engineer might be able to flip through for insights as they make their way in the world. And there's a way that, just on first blush, one could be concerned that this might be a similar book. And obviously, it very much isn't. And I think maybe it's worth saying a bit about what we were doing instead. And our inspiration really was the work that people have done over the decades about the category of Fordism. So that category was coined 100 years ago, exactly, interestingly, in German, Fordismus. And it was taken to mean what the author called the dictatorship of technical reason. And he meant that as a compliment. So he thought that there was something that was happening in Ford's plants that exceeded Ford the man, and that also implied a kind of transformation of the society around it. And the Fordism that this person, Werner von Gottel Lilienfeld, I think is his name, was trying to get into was the same thing that people, including Antonio Gramsci, not long after, and then most notably a bunch of French sociologists in the 1970s, were like, what version of the social contract is coming together here in an era of mass manufacturing, when most people earn their keep in the factories of people like Ford, and how is society being reformatted around it? And that was really the question that me and Ben were motivated by in asking this with this book, is like, not just how did Elon make his millions and now trillion, but what does it imply about a kind of reformatted society that A, allowed him to make that much money, and then B, is being changed in the wake of his accumulation of that much money. And I think what we came down to was that there are kind of three big stories of the early 21st century that Musk helps us kind of narrate and walk through, that maybe we don't always have front of mind as much as we should. I mean, people like you do, but not average readers often don't. One is the rise of China as a near peer economic power to the United States, which is, a very recent, that's within our lifetimes that's happened. The second is the possibility of something like a green capitalism. So the attempt to combine, property in the price mechanism with some attention to climate transition is also really a new development in the last couple of decades. And then thirdly, of course, is the overwhelming dominance of digital capitalism in the American political economy, and by extension, the global political economy. And Musk, what makes him interesting is that he was able to sort of surf along each of those waves of accumulation, and a few others to boot, such that if you follow his biography, you're also following, the coming together of a new mode of global capitalism that in the end, of course, he has now been coronated as the single biggest beneficiary of.
Okay, so all of that said, so he drew from each of these sort of like little mini eras and sort of and trend lines all converging this way, and he sort of
Hmm.
cannily does this, and I think maybe the SpaceX chapter and is the one that maybe has traditionally been glossed over the most in the precise
Hmm.
mechanism, the way that he recognizes
Yeah.
that the state isn't something to spurn or to sort of, puff your chest out and say capitalism is better, but to be extracted from, but to be leaned
Hmm.
on. And then that SpaceX ends up kind of being the vehicle for, his biggest bets and whatever, the container that collects everything else, perhaps the superset, if you will. So,
Yeah, yeah. No, totally. Yeah. The
so
vertically integrated into innovation engine is how he's calling it now.
yeah, that's right. So let's since SpaceX is the one that IPO'd, that every kind of XAI got absorbed into it, and it's kind of it becomes sort of the motor of all this. Let's talk a little bit about
Sure.
how that came about, and how that's
Hmm.
core to Muskism.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that Musk or Silicon Valley operators in general are libertarians at heart is really a kind of red herring that we were dead set on disabusing people of by the end of this book. I mean, especially if you use Musk as a standard. I have no clear memory of him even calling himself a libertarian, so much less acting consistently as one. And that's not to like save the glory and honor of libertarianism. It's just to point out that from his very first ventures, so even ones people haven't probably heard of, Zip2, the sort of city directory service that he launches in the 90s with his brother Kimball, relies on free access to the GPS constellation that just went online. PayPal, which of course is where he makes his first fortune, is reliant on federal deposit insurance on consumer bank accounts, right? That's why people feel confident having their money then, which is then zapped by PayPal, but it's not held by PayPal in the original incarnation. With SpaceX, it just becomes a lot more explicit, right? And that was a fun chapter to put together. Ben wrote the lion's share of it, but we set it up with this, I still think, extraordinary moment where Donald Rumsfeld is giving a speech at the Pentagon on September 10th, 2001, so the day before 9/11. And he says, the Cold War is over, but we have a new enemy, and the enemy is us. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. We are sclerotic and hidebound, and we need to innovate. And we need to do that by bringing in more energy from specifically Silicon Valley and the newcomers into the ossified world of the military prime contractors. And we need to be more agile for a new kind of warfare, because war is not going to be about big land armies, right? The 300,000 people in Iraq and a couple of years later, notwithstanding. But there will also be special forces deployed all over the world. There will be long distance munitions guided to their target by satellites. So we're going to need to get a lot more cheap tactile satellites up in the sky. And Musk steps in. 2002 is when SpaceX is launched to say, I'm your guy. I will do launch cheaper than Boeing and cheaper than other competitors. And that's really where he makes his first entry point into this sort of direct relationship with the state as client rather than just as kind of enabler, as in the case of the internet itself as the result of military R&D and so on. And then in Tesla, we tell a similar story because Tesla gets its first big life-saving loan from the Department of Energy in 2009 to basically help America's foreign policy goals, which had now switched from getting into Iraq to getting out of Iraq, and electrifying the auto sector and building out the renewable sector to not be as reliant on foreign oil. So that's Obama's green industrial policy. And once again, Musk is there to be like, I'm your guy. Like, what do you need now? And as we know, up into 2024, he was still getting 40% of the revenue of Tesla from zero emission vehicle credits that people were buying off of him, mostly in California. So that's very much a state initiative. It's a de-risking of private investment for a political goal, which isn't always bad, right? As the green case shows. But it's just, in our opinion, a ground clearing kind of helpful starting point to talk about any of this sort of tech government relationship in terms of what we call state symbiosis, rather than the ideas of exit or escape that have long dominated these debates. I mean, in the AI era, above all, there's no exiting. Like, you need access to too many resources, too much land, too much state capacity to dream of doing this from like a decommissioned oil rig in the South Pacific or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. And I want to talk about that in a minute here. But let's put a peg in that for 1 second, and because I do want to talk about his time, his beginnings in apartheid South Africa before we start to tie all these threads together. Just because I think you make so many excellent points that just kind of are often sort of glossed over. Like nobody quite knows what to do with this chapter in his life. I feel like people you don't really want to talk about it because it's, you know, it's ugly in a lot of ways just because of the era that it belongs to, and it's hard to, you know, make any kind of sweeping judgments. I don't think you make the sweeping judgments. I think that what you talk about are all these interesting sort of often overlooked elements of apartheid South Africa. So let's talk about that. Can you talk about looking at sort of, you know, what this period, his upbringing, you know, it really sort of, you know, the key strands of DNA begin to be woven into Muskism there.
Sure. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree that, you know, careful critics, I think, the topic can be a bit radioactive because it's like, you know, you want to be able to, if you're critical of Musk, to simply say, you know, and lots of posters on Blue Sky and X certainly do, like, what do you mean? The guy's from South Africa. He's a racist. He always has been. He's born in apartheid and he's just bringing it back now. And I think that, you know, as a historian, as an academic, I'm not quite comfortable enough with that much sweeping guilt by association without like a pretty good paper trail. And the paper trail gets complicated pretty fast, right? Because not only do you have the starting point, which is that Musk was part of the English-speaking, you know, the Anglo-white class, which under apartheid South Africa was not actually the governing class, right? So you had a Boer class, the Afrikaner-speaking Dutch group, which actually sees its roots in the defeat of the British during the Boer War as the dominant class, really like coming up with apartheid. There's a reason why apartheid is an Afrikaner word and not a word in English that we use. And the English class was often wealthy, but often treated the Afrikaner project of apartheid with a kind of disdain or distance or like non-involvement. So they weren't the English-speaking class were not the ones, you know, holding the high ministerial offices that were coming to these new policies of Bantustans and homelands and so on. They were often kind of withdrawn into their own enclaves, the way that Musk grew up, which is, you know, going to a private school that was modeled on Eton and Harrow, like modeled on the British example, sometimes even having little islands of racial tolerance or even openness in places like that. So they actually did allow, you know, Black students before that was common elsewhere. One anecdote from Musk's childhood is that he went to the funeral of, I think the sibling of a Black student who was from his school. And the paper trail we have from Musk's childhood doesn't actually scream racist. And in fact, we know that when he left, he's described the decision as having not wanting to join a fascist army. So what then can we make of the South African upbringing? I think one argument you can make becomes more psychologizing, which is like, well, he imbibed that stuff even if he seemed to reject it at the time, and it's now resurfacing. And his disdain for Black people, which may have been baked into him, is now on full display. And I honestly give some credence to that argument. Yeah. I think the vehemence of his reaction against the South African government doing something which is fully within their rights as a sovereign country, which is to say, hey, we have our own racial justice policies in this country. They come from, you know, decades of apartheid. We want there to be Black ownership of major businesses, and Starlink and SpaceX, we're not following those. So we're not going to let you have Starlink's Starlink receivers in this country, right? His reaction to that was to kind of revert back to full like gutter racist Afrikaner mode and become a major advocate of the white genocide conspiracy theory and to advocate for the refugee status of white Afrikaners in the United States, which of course they did secure. So there is that side I don't want to downplay.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is an interesting, much less discussed story. It's the one that you mentioned, which is that despite its obviously reactionary politics that was out of step with most of the modern world by the late 1980s, South Africa did make use of some cutting edge technologies, not just the IBM mainframes, as you say, to kind of conduct apartheid, but also they really built out a domestic auto sector. So rather than just importing cars from Japan and the US and Germany, they would license the ability to make their own plants. So within a short drive from where Musk grew up in the Pretoria suburbs, you would have a Datsun plant, you had a Ford plant, you had a BMW plant. And furthermore, they built out their own nuclear program. So another less than an hour drive from where Musk grew up, you had Pelindaba, which was the nuclear research facility where they had a functioning bomb developed by the early 1980s. This is actually no small thing, actually, to join the nuclear club at that point. So we describe the political economic model that was happening in South Africa at that time as fortress futurism, because it was very dead set on economic self-sufficiency, but it was not, unplugging from the global economy and going back to an earlier era. It was using high tech to reinforce self-sufficiency because, very importantly, they were beset by enemies both outside and inside, and they were very paranoid about, social infection and in an incursion by literal guerrillas at the border, and then the more distant like sanctions that were being laid on them by that time by many other countries. So that model seemed at the time to be very out of joint with the trend of global capitalism, right? I mean, it was the time of Reaganism, it would soon be the time of Clintonism, the WTO, free trade, outsourcing, the sweatshop moment of the 1990s, right? Like big brands just license the ability to make their products to a whole network of subcontractors, and then they skim off the profits of the IP and the name recognition and sell them in their stores in the US. South Africa was like doing something totally different. It was trying to do kind of vertical integration in miniature. And Musk becomes mostly known as an industrialist for kind of reviving that model very early. So, you wrote, I think, the best book about the iPhone, your one device book. And that model, as you make very clear, was an artifact of the peak of free trade globalization in some ways, right? Like it was designed to be designed in California, assembled in China, and with components from spread the net as widely as you can. The whole point of SpaceX rockets, the whole point of Teslas was to shorten those supply chains and bring the control as much as possible inside the factory under the roof of one firm, and to have oversight and the ability to kind of micromanage it as much as possible. And people thought that was crazy. People were like, what are you doing? Like, why are you making your own parts? Like, get them made cheaply in China. That's what we're all doing. And his resistance to that is something that made him seem like a kind of outsider in the early 2000s. But then by the time of the COVID shock, by the time of the Russia shock, by the time of the latest Iran shock, the drive for self-reliance or autonomy that apartheid South Africa had kind of pioneered or modeled now becomes the thing that everyone wants to do. So that fortress futurism, embodied in, as you say, even in the anime of Robotech or Transformers, these isolated civilizations under attack by aliens that need to fuse with humanoid robots to defend themselves, now look like kind of what everyone's doing.
Yeah, and there's so much there in his time in South Africa, as you mentioned in the book. You point out that he's like, as he's driving by the street, I think a lot of that sort of baked in racism or othering also comes from, and or is now expressed, we see in the way that he calls people that he wants to just kind of disregard as NPCs. It's like he sort of is sort of growing this sense that that there are others to be managed, to serve their purpose, and then he is sort of this actor that is
Well,
yeah.
and it's a very different, I mean, he's not that much older than you and I. And if you think about the zeitgeist of like the 80s and 90s in the US, I didn't grow up in the US, but I was in Canada. It's close enough. The idea was, if you would take like that Clintonite model of neoliberalism, I mean, think about the relationship to racism in that period. I mean, it was considered to good liberals as something that was like an artifact of the past. It was being overcome through meritocracy. The market was doing its work. It was giving everyone a shot. And eventually, the talented people would be picked out through competition and hard work and grit. And to sort of call back to the basic racial inferiority of another people would be like, it'd be a real record scratch in the 80s and 90s in most living rooms and kind of classrooms. Like, I mean, there's a reason why the bell curve in 1994 was such a big deal, is because it did a bit of that bringing back of like racial essentialism. But contrast that to Musk's upbringing, where he's just like living in a world where it's taken for granted that most of the population are like not really human. I mean, they're not really people who need to be even appealed to, certainly not as voters, not really as like workers either. They're just units to be moved around by the apartheid state as necessary. Of course, they always resisted. And interestingly enough, it would be a whole other side story, but the auto sector was a place where Black workers were actually able to get a pretty high level of recognition for their demands just because they were so necessary for the South African economic model. But for the most part, like if that's your mindset, it's like growing up in like the antebellum South. It's not far from that, right? And so it's then normal to not, and this is, I think, what gets to something that's really important about what makes Muskism different from neoliberalism, is you don't really think about needing to appeal to people's individual sense of freedom in the same way that, at least under neoliberalism, you kind of needed to finesse that, right? Like you needed to, in Clinton's years, you had to be like, no, you get to choose, like it's your product, like you get to customize your identity any way you want. And there's like leftish and rightish versions of that, but at least that was like the kind of lingua franca.
Right.
What's I think so interesting about Muskism, and it does go into like Altman and others too, is they're kind of like, oh, no, like we decide.
Yeah.
Like individual freedom is actually probably not going to work in the model that we're proposing, because we need to actually aggregate, collective energies and capacities towards this project that we're working on, that we're actually not consulting you about, and that we know might have adverse effects on your livelihood in the short term, but just like trust us, like for unspecified reasons, just trust us. It's like, what? Like, why would you think you could get away with that?
Yeah, I wonder if we can extrapolate, and then if Muskism is this hostility towards workforces and the sovereignty, over them, does it stand to reason that the next sort of step in the evolution of Muskism, or I guess the expansion of Muskism, is the AI moment in which there's a complete almost erasure of the worker's place, or almost a speculative kind of world in which mass, what we hear Dario Amodei from Anthropic or Sam Altman saying all the time, that millions of workers are going to be gone, and this is the tacit promise to their business partners.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we've been talking mostly about the first half of the book, which is called Foundation, in a nod to the Asimov book, which Ben would meant a lot to Ben, so it was important for him to like kind of work with that. And the second half, though, is called Cyborg, and our argument as it unfolds there is that you can't understand, Musk's turn to the right or the switches in his business model without realizing how thoroughly he embraces this idea of man-machine fusion as necessary to save civilization, quote unquote, to advance his business interests and so on. And absolutely, I mean, as you're saying, the promise of generative AI after the big breakout after November 2022 and the launch of ChatGPT is like, oh, wow, now we can actually start thinking seriously about the obsolescence of large chunks of the labor force in a way that had been more speculative before. And the way that the SpaceX conglomerate has now been assembled is totally in service of that, right? So you mentioned in passing that earlier this year, XAI bought X.com, and then SpaceX bought XAI to create, in the terms of the SpaceX prospectus, this vertically integrated innovation engine. And the way that profits are promised to those people, dropping a pretty good chunk of money down for SpaceX shares, despite its, like over 100 price to earnings ratio, is that it's going to be the dominant player in AI, right? So most of the profits being promised by SpaceX, it's like over 85% of the profits are about mostly enterprise AI. That's what it's going to be. And anyone rationally looking at what they've managed to achieve so far as winning market share away from the competitors, OpenAI, Anthropic, would be wondering how he could possibly make this claim, because it looks like he's in no position to challenge them. And ironically, even when he was in court in Oakland testifying against Altman, this was the small bean rhetorical strategy he took himself, right? I don't know if you saw that, but he was like, oh no, XAI could never compete with OpenAI and Anthropic. No, they're miles ahead of us. No, we don't see them as our competitors. How could I be trying to dent their competitive edge? That's obviously not part of what's going on. So, I mean, he was lying. But the SpaceX prospectus is the acting lie, the operative lie, which is like, no, we're going to catch up to them and actually leapfrog them. And the question of why anyone should believe them rests on two things. One, the orbital AI data centers, which he claims are right around the corner, despite no advance on them at all or working prototype. But two, and this is, I think, getting more to your question, and I think it's kind of not covered as much as it should be, is macro hard, which, funny play on Microsoft. I think it is a kind of a funny play on Microsoft. I'll give him his tiniest amount of flowers for that one. But what it is also known as digital Optimus. And it's the best reason why Tesla will probably be incorporated into SpaceX sooner rather than later too. Because what macro hard is, what digital Optimus is an attempt to use humanoid robots to recreate the white collar office worker, ostensibly to guide spaceships on very long interplanetary flights, but more concretely to just start doing office work here on Earth. So rather than, automating away an office task through like an API or an AI agent, it's literally creating a humanoid robot who will sit at a screen and do the work that a human would have done previously. So that, I think, is the other edge that people see, like, maybe it will actually be easier not to teach the computers to do all of the white collar work, but actually just to create a humanoid robot. A lot easier if they're just sitting there, right? They don't have to manipulate objects in space as much. And they can just do that symbolic analyst work that has been the heart of the American economy for so long. And that will be the thing that makes Musk, able to defeat his competitors.
Yeah. We've really sort of drilled into a lot of the core elements of Muskism. We've talked about sort of how it came about and the evolution. I'm wondering if you have like a pithy, now Fordism has been distilled down into like the economic system that, is mass production for mass consumption. Do you have, do you got the bumper sticker Muskism definition yet?
I mean, no. The short answer is no. But I mean, I think that the best we've done is it's the promise of sovereignty through technology. Yeah. That cashes out as deeper dependence on private service providers like himself.
Yeah.
So that is helpful maybe because it also shows that sovereignty is not just of states, it's also of individuals. Yeah. So our whole chapter on Tesla is called Electric Autonomy. And it's quite striking to see how he sells Tesla products now, right? He's like, you say something's happening, there's a wildfire, there's a snowstorm or a brownout. If you have a Starlink receiver and solar panels on your roof and a Powerwall in your garage and a Cybertruck in your driveway, then you've kind of armored yourself against reliance on public infrastructure and public grids. And not only that, but you now have a literal kind of armored vehicle that you can use to, pass through whatever kind of social unrest is unfolding. And at one of the Tesla shareholders meeting, he literally said, pretty good for preppers. You'll have everything you need. So that was an offhand comment. But, if you look at the shape of the Cybertruck, which a couple of researchers, we mentioned this in passing, have noted a striking resemblance to the armored vehicles used to put down uprisings in the townships in South Africa, then it's an really important kind of distillation of his vision of the future, which is not actually one of amazing abundance, as he briefly referred to it, but one in which there's some people are inside the walls and most people are not. Yeah. And that if you want to be inside the walls, then you better bolt yourself onto him and all of his endeavors as tightly as you possibly can, because he's going to both make you money and he's going to give you the means of securing your own sovereignty in the short term, as things continue to unravel. And there's something about that dark envisioning of the near future, which I think really lands for a lot of people, right? And not just the Musk fans. There's probably parts of that kind of resonate with the way you and I might imagine things unfolding in the next few years. So if he's able to stand there and say, I'm your protector, right, I am your guardian.
You want to survive the dystopia that's coming, the inequality.
Exactly. It's not the old promise of endless customer customization. Yeah. And it's not the promise of infinite growth that eventually will trickle down, but it's just a very much starker, inside and outside.
Yeah.
And the fact that I think nothing's more resonant for this than the fact that the week before he launches the biggest IPO in history, SpaceX, he's actually posting much more about the race riots in Belfast than he is about SpaceX, right? So why? Well, it makes no sense, but because he sees a virtuous circle and a feedback loop between people's feelings of fear and insecurity and social war and divisiveness and his business model, right? He's actually selling you the means of fortification and the ability to unplug from something that had been previously called, a collective society or nation.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's a remarkably sort of, dark pitch. And it says something, again, about our economic moment, that it's been so successful. And it is, yep. It is the challenge of sort of Muskism resists pithiness because there are so many ingredients. I do, as you elaborate, in the book, you do need the fortress futurism. You do need sovereignty as a service, and you do need the financial fatalism. And you need all of these things to sort of come together. And given that given that these things have come together, now he's on top. The last question I want to ask you is, how do we combat Muskism? How do you oppose or even resist Muskism?
Well, I think he's actually got tons of vulnerabilities. So the people who have been the best at questioning his dominance have been in actually the BRICS countries, right? If you look beyond the industrialized North, you find, okay, what did China do? They made use of Musk. They brought him in, juiced their EV sector, juiced their lithium-ion battery, and then kind of eased him out, or at least displaced him with BYD and CATL now is far outperforming his products, his Tesla products. Look at the way Russia has dealt with him. They've used him for Starlink insofar as necessary, but they haven't opened up their market entirely to him. South Africa has refused to let Starlink receivers in. India continues to refuse to let Starlink receivers in, despite the fact that, as anyone who goes on X knows, there's a lot of Indian-produced content there amongst the Musk fanboys, especially Doggy Designer and the like. So they've actually, Brazil, seized Starlink assets when Musk refused to do content moderation on people trying to overthrow the Brazilian government. That's actually gutsy, deployment of national sovereignty against his bottom line. And nothing he hates more than that. The EU has been much more timid, but there's signs now of pushing back, right? Not only the invasion of the X offices in Paris earlier this year, fines against him through the European Commission, investigations about the use of X as a CSAM generator and a producer of disinformation. But also now, as of just this week, actually, real concrete efforts to create SpaceX competitors by merging Airbus and Leonardo, by holding chunks of the spectrum for EU firms. Two things that Musk is very angry about, basically. So if you look at the bottom line of his SpaceX pitch, it really implies that the whole world is going to go along with his endeavors. And they actually aren't. And they're already defecting from his products. And I think that he's doing basically everything he can to make that accelerate, given how polarizing and inflammatory his posting and his rhetoric has been recently. More close to home, the next likely democratically controlled Congress is probably going to bring him in for some discussions about what he did at Doge, right? I mean, he's been crashing out Musk this week because Ro Khanna said that he should be investigated by Congress. And I think he's probably really worried about that.
Threatening to sue him and threatening to...
Exactly. I mean, as the moment that a kind of cascade effect begins of people, including still, political entities, just deleting their X accounts, finding alternatives to Starlink, building out competitors, even if it's like the somewhat no less noxious Blue Origin instead of SpaceX. Still, I think that he has the power he has because people have kind of granted him the impression of invulnerability that he's cultivated. And the more that gets picked away at, I think, the better it will be for humanity at large.
Yeah, agreed. Well, since we did kind of get there, I guess I will just add one follow-on question, which is like, how did this, what did eventually sort of culminate and transpire at Doge when he does bring in, and he brings in, and Muskism basically enters the White House?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was fascinating. I mean, it's really what started us writing the book is watching it happen. There really was that moment in January, February of 2025 when people talked about little else, right? I mean, I realized this when I went back to sort of sort through all the takes and all the coverage, of which there was extraordinary journalism being performed by Wired, especially Washington Post, especially, including many journalists who have since been fired from Washington Post. Wall Street Journal even was doing good on the ground, real investigative journalism. And we would be screwed if we didn't have this. It's one of the things that scares me most, actually. I know it's something you've written really, really well about, is the gutting of the journalistic profession and how at sea we are without journalism. I mean, if we have what X.com presents as today's news, right, as a sidebar on X.com, it's actually horrifying, right? It's just what Musk wants you to think is today's news. And that is what he's trying to create. So you could see Doge, all of those takes accumulated to, I think, some insights at the time that we tried to glean out. One is that he wasn't just trying to destroy the state as such, right? He wasn't trying to, I think, just eliminate the federal government. He was trying to turn it, as you alluded to a moment ago, into state X. He was trying to reformat the government in such a way that it would fulfill his interests more directly and become ever more reliant on the products that he produces and that his colleagues and previous co-investors produce. So what did he do with the different agencies? Well, yes, he de-siloed them by making data, readable from one agency to another, to make them accessible, interoperable, queryable, especially by Palantir products, to make the Department of War and the Pentagon more dependent on, as we know now, AI targeting tools and selling Grok to the Pentagon, even as he's rolling out, spicy AI sex bots and companions. So he was turning the government into something that worked for him and discarding what he saw as the surplus humans that were parasitical on the system. So USAID, who cares? These people are doing nothing for his products. Immigrants who are obviously paying into Social Security and often not taking it back. Nevertheless, they're parasites. They need to be found and purged from this system. And I guess the biggest addition, added value we try to bring into that chapter is how much he gamified the whole process. That it's not for nothing that he put a giant curved gaming monitor into the Doge office, that he, in the image he posted, had a photoshopped image of Kekius Maximus, his like Pepe avatar, produced by Grok Imagine, on the wall in the place of a previous US politician, and that he made a leaderboard for Doge, and that the whole thing was imported from memes on Twitter, and that he oscillated between Diablo 4 and Path of Exile and, the gutting of agencies. These things were the same for him, right? And that blending of reality between the digital and the physical, and the on and offline, is something that is essential to understand about Musk, or else much of it doesn't make sense. And I think that was the goal of our book too, was to kind of like push the reader into his strange headspace to try to understand it from a perspective they might not have before.
Right. Where that gamification can then take such precedence that we have such tragic collateral damage as a result.
Exactly.
It's more important.
Yeah. But he had no framework to process that in, right?
Yeah.
Like the normal humanitarian categories of even like Bill Gates, like reduced human deaths, is actually not a metric he's interested in.
Yeah.
Right. That's the thing that's most striking. It's like the worker relationship, the idea of basic humanitarianism is just like not a statistic he keeps in mind or has any use for.
It is. It's almost like it's just unreal to him. Like it never had. He can just kind of vanish. It's not on the leaderboard, so it's not real, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we covered a lot of ground today. This was great. I honestly, I cannot recommend this book enough. Muskism is, I think, the book not just to understand Musk himself, but this moment, and I think where we're going in terms of how tech CEOs and companies are now sort of imagining their businesses and perpetrating their businesses and leaning on the state to do so. So there's a lot in there, and thanks so much for joining us today and talking through it. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Cheers, Quinn.
Bye-bye.
All right. That will do it for this week. Thank you. Thank you to Quinn Slobodian and to his co-author, friend of the show, wherever he is, Ben Tarnoff. Go pick up Muskism, a guide for the perplexed. It really is maybe the best book. I hate to just be definitive and say this is the best book written about Elon Musk. For my money, I think if you want to understand the totality of what Elon Musk means, and in the context of everything that's happening in tech right now, everything that's happening in our economy right now, then I think this is the book. So it's great. Could not recommend it more. Go get that book and follow Ben and Quinn's work everywhere else. Thank you also to the infinitely talented and very patient. He has endured many time change woes and discrepancies, many weird requests at late hours. We've made this thing work while I've been in Paris. Ryan Hodis, say hi, Ryan.
Hey, everybody. Well, I did it all with the help of Grok while I was waiting for you. Was just
don't
away.
Reveal our secret. Ryan is an AI generated avatar by Grok. Next week he will be like an elf anime avatar with like a sword or something, whatever Elon Musk fantasizes about. But thanks to Ryan for another great production job. Thanks to Kate Osborne, to Corinne Shadme for the art, to Ryan Hall for the music. Thank you for listening. As always, we are entering the period of the show where it would be great if you could subscribe on YouTube, review, I don't know, do all the stuff that people do for podcasts. The show is taking off, and we want to fan the flames of its growth. And I think you can help us do that. Again, you start talking like this, I don't know who I'm talking to anymore. I'm just talking into the void. Maybe we shouldn't include this. Maybe we should. Does anyone listen to the end of podcasts? Anyone out there ever? Who knows? I don't know. I will shout one more thing, and that is this week a survey that I played a tiny part in helping to design, that's being led by the theater director Annie Dorson, that's looking for information about the impact of generative AI on the performing arts, on performing artists, on workers in that field. I will leave the link to that survey, which is live now, in the show notes. If that applies to you, please do go take it. All right. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and keep those hammers up.